when you start looking at what all of these health things do, it all comes down to just one thing.
This book really blew my mind. Lots of good new information. Right off the top, when I'm seeing the title of this book, all your other books had paradox. Well, not all of them if we go way back, but your latest books all had paradox in the title. Were you contemplating a title with paradox, or you just decided that's over and done with?
Well, actually, the original, working title was The Keto Paradox. But, and it actually is a paradox as you get into the book, but there was a whole lot more than just the paradox in there. In fact, interestingly enough, I was pushing for a title that was The Secret to Good Health comes down to just one thing, and it's not what you think. So, and I got voted down, so it's okay. So this is Unlocking the Keto Code, because once you understand what ketos are actually doing, it actually opens up a whole new world to drop down the rabbit hole.
Well, we're going to get into all that, but what I want to start is you left us hanging there. You talked about this one thing, which almost became the title of the book. What is this one thing?
This one thing is mitochondrial uncoupling, and most people, actually including me, had actually never heard that term. Most of us think of uncoupling, maybe thanks to my friend Gwyneth Paltrow, who uncoupled her marriage. But it's actually a term that's been used to describe what mitochondria can do. Actually, since 1978 it was first described. So when I was writing my last book, The Energy Paradox, I like to spend some time defending a statement that I make with research. And so I've always said in all my books that a ketogenic diet increases energy efficiency. It makes your mitochondria more efficient, and that's how you become an efficient fat burner. And as I sat around trying to document what everybody knew, including me, that ketones make you an efficient fat burner, lo and behold, the literature, even in humans, suggests exactly the opposite, that ketones make you a horribly inefficient energy producer and fat burner. And I went, what? How can that be? And so that actually prompted me to write this book. I didn't plan on writing this book, but I said, holy cow, I got to let people know. And then I, went down the rabbit hole and haven't come out yet.
Well, let's go deeper into that. You talked about ketones making you an inefficient fat burner. That's a pretty bold statement considering what, people in the health and wellness space, especially the keto space, are touting these days. So talk more about that.
Well, so let's go back a little bit. The ketones were first described in the late 1800s, a German discovery. And nobody really knew what they were. It was thought that they were a toxic byproduct of type 1 diabetes. And that was kind of what they were chalked up to be. Fast forward to the 1920s, when children with epilepsy, there was no drug treatment for epilepsy in those days, were noted that if they had tons of epileptic seizures, that they were kind of comatose half the time and they weren't eating. And interestingly enough, when these children were starving, their seizures abated. And some researchers, particularly at Harvard and subsequently in Minneapolis, said, wait a minute, ketones are generated during starvation, and maybe it's the ketones that are stopping the seizures. We don't know why they stop the seizures, but it sure looks like that would do it. And so in Minneapolis, the term ketogenic diet was coined in 1930 to describe a diet for childhood epilepsy consisting of 80% fat, 10% carbohydrates, and 10% protein. And lo and behold, when children were put on this diet, at least 50% of them had resolution of their seizures, or else really dramatic better control of their seizures. So it really became the standard of care for kids with seizures. And it really worked with some unfortunate side effects. Kids didn't grow very well. They were stunted. And quite frankly, as any of us who are parents or grandparents know, it's really hard to get a kid to avoid carbohydrates. And so this was a very unpalatable diet. And when phenobarbital and Dilantin and other anti-seizure drugs came along, this diet pretty much fell by the wayside. Interestingly, it had a resurgence in the 1980s when it was found that a MCT oil-based diet, and we'll get into that in a while, I suspect, you could get the same seizure control with an MCT oil-based diet with much less fat and a whole lot more carbohydrates and protein. And in fact, that was the impetus for me when I was using the ketogenic diet in my program to base it on MCT oil. And just recently, we had a young kid in high school in special ed because of his severe seizure disorders, which when they drug him, the guy couldn't even, think. And so his mother brought him to me, 17-year-old guy. And just recently, we put him on my ketogenic diet. And boy, the kid woke up, came off his drugs. He's now playing soccer, which he never did before, intramural soccer. And it's just like, holy cow, it's a miracle. His seizures are gone on this program. So ketones were investigated for, okay, why did they do this? And primarily researchers at Harvard and the NIH, George Cahill and Dr. Veach at the NIH, looked into, well, why do ketones exist, and what are they doing, and how do they affect the brain? What they found, along with Dr. Owens, who was George Cahill's student, they found that during starvation, normally, most of us can generate free fatty acids out of our fat cells, and we can actually, all of our cells in our body, except our brain, can use free fatty acids as a great fuel to make ATP. Unfortunately, free fatty acids are big fat-soluble molecules that can't cross the blood-brain barrier. And they can, but it's incredibly slow. So now we know that free fatty acids go to the liver, and the liver makes ketones, ketone bodies. The liver can't use ketones, and so they're released into the circulation. And these are small, water-soluble fats, and they can get through the blood-brain barrier. And lo and behold, neurons can use these water-soluble fats, ketones, as a substitute fuel for glucose to kind of keep the brain alive. Now, Dr. Veach kind of went crazy, and he says, oh my gosh, look at this. This fuel keeps the brain alive, so it's the greatest fuel of all time, and we should always be in ketosis, and it's our natural state. We should always be starving. And he actually got so popular, he made the cover of Time magazine a number of years ago. But unfortunately, he was wrong. And this was proved by Dr. Owens in as late as 2004. And he took human beings, put them on a ketogenic diet. Loads of ketones were generated. And at full ketosis, only 30% of the calorie needs of the human body could be met by ketones. 70% had to be met by free fatty acids and or glucose. Even the brain, which you got to have ketones when you're starving, even at full ketosis, only 60 to 70% of the brain's metabolic needs are met by ketones, and the brain still needs 30 to 40% glucose, even at full ketosis. Now, that just threw Veach under the bus, And this is published literature out of Harvard, out of the fathers of ketone research, and yet nobody seems to know that. People need to know. And so then you look at this and go, well, wait a minute. This isn't a super fuel. This isn't the greatest performance benefit of all time. And I go into the literature of whether or not this improves performance or doesn't improve performance, and the literature is mixed. But if that isn't the world's perfect fuel, then what the heck are ketones doing? And that's the code that I unlock in the book.
So just to summarize there, that was a great explanation. But you're not saying ketones are useless as fuel. You're just saying they've been built up to this keystone, most important fuel by a lot of the people in the keto world. They do serve a purpose as that. But what you get at in your book, which we're going to get into now, is they are beneficial, but for another purpose. So I'll have you talk about that.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, I think one of the most fascinating parts of these studies, particularly from Cahill and Owens, is that at 3 days into a starvation, ketone production really ramps up in normal human beings, and we'll get into that in a minute. And muscles at 3 days get most of their energy from burning ketones. But by 50 days, everything is shifted to free fatty acids, and very little, 30%, is from ketones. So if muscles are getting their maximum benefit from ketones at 3 days, then we would expect that their athletic performance ought to skyrocket at 3 days when their ketone use is the most. But in fact, even Dr. Finney and Vogel show that normal athletes, their performance plummets at 3 to 2 weeks using a ketogenic diet. And so, wait a minute. If the muscles are using ketones at 3 days and that's all the fuel they want, why isn't your performance over the top? So even their research, and I love their research, and I quote it in the book, shows that can't be possible, that ketones are the world's greatest fuel.
So what we're summarizing here as a whole is they are a fuel for the body, but they're there as an emergency fuel. A fuel that's there to keep us alive if we're in starvation and the body needs to switch its energy source.
Correct. And they're really there as a fuel source for the brain. And it is a backup fuel source. It is not the world's greatest fuel source for the brain. Now, they do have some very interesting effects on the brain that I get into later on in the book, but they're not there as some super fuel for the brain.
Let's get into the uncoupling. This is the biggest thesis from the new book, and this is something I want to really get into and cover deeply. So we've now dismissed, the traditional thoughts in the keto world about what ketones do, but let's talk about the uncoupling and why they serve this other purpose that's actually very profound.
Yeah, and probably as a lead into that, there are actually multiple studies looking at a low-carb ketogenic diet versus a normal carb diet, or even a high-carb diet for weight loss. And also, many of these studies look at metabolic rates in the subject individuals. And there have been multiple ones, but the long story short is that if you look at these diets over 6 months to a year, there's actually almost no difference between a low-carb ketogenic diet and a normal carb diet on a weight loss regimen. Very little, and I show many documentations. But in these studies, there's little kind of cute pearls that bear our attention. And that is, if you look at like 3 weeks into the diet, 4 weeks into the diet, there's actually no difference in metabolic rates between the ketogenic diet and the high-carb diet. Everybody's kind of burning the same calories. But if you follow these studies out, and most studies don't go much farther than a month or so, if you follow these studies out, after that point, the ketogenic diet, the low-carb diet, they begin to increase their metabolic rate and above the high-carbohydrate diet. And you go, well, that's interesting. Why on a ketogenic diet, and if ketones are a protect yourself from starving mechanism, why in the world would your metabolic rate increase? Why would you burn more calories than the carbohydrate diet? That doesn't make sense. And that was what I and pretty much all the keto experts kept saying is, you're going to be an efficient fat burner. Why? And yes, your metabolic rate might go down because you're an efficient fat burner, but in fact, your metabolic rate goes up. So there was a fascinating paper that anyone interested in the ketogenic diet really ought to read. It's an easy paper to read. It's written by a PhD by the name of Dr. Martin Brand, and it was written in the year 2000, so fairly recent. And the paper is called Uncoupling to Survive. And what he said is that in extremis, if you're starving to death, if the organism has nothing to eat, then mitochondria have to protect themselves at all costs. Because if the mitochondria dies, then who cares about the muscles? Who cares about anything? Because the mitochondria is what generates the energy. And so he proposed that mitochondria actually ought to, as paradoxic as it sounds, waste energy and throw a lot of the calories that they would normally use to produce ATP out side exits, emergency exits in the electron transport chain so that they protect themselves. Now, it turns out that making ATP is dirty business. It's hard work. It generates a lot of damage to the mitochondria. And most people have heard of reactive oxygen species, ROSs, free radicals. These, and I have a fun time with it, with the analogy of the Mito Club to describe how ATP is made. And literally what you want to do is you want to couple a proton with an oxygen molecule and generate ATP. And it's literally called coupling. You want to put a proton and an oxygen together and bind them. The product is water and ATP and carbon dioxide. So that's coupling to produce energy. But it turns out that that's damaging to mitochondria. So there ought to be a method to literally pop off all the extra pressure to make ATP. Very much like a pressure cooker, once it gets to a very high pressure, has a pop-off valve, and you hear the steam coming out. If it didn't have that pop-off valve, you'd blow up the pressure cooker like my mother did when I was growing up. Very exciting. All over the ceiling. So we have to have pop-off valves. And these pop-off valves are controlled. There's 5 of them in every mitochondria, and they're called uncoupling proteins. And I didn't make up the word uncoupling. I wouldn't have used that word, but sorry, that's what it's called. So they throw out protons through these emergency exits or a pop-off valve of a pressure cooker to prevent damage to the mitochondria. Now, here's the amazing thing. At rest, 30% of all the calories we eat are uncoupled from making ATP at rest. Now, if you think about it, what a dumb design for an organism. You've got to literally eat 30% more calories every day to generate the amount of ATP to stay alive. So you go, what a weird design. Why, why would a biologic system have this design? Well, the answer is for a couple of reasons. Number one, blowing off those extra calories generates heat, and we're a warm-blooded animal. And it turns out cold-blooded animals actually are relatively warm-blooded, just less than us. So all animals use this uncoupling to generate heat. Most of us have heard of brown fat. Brown fat is so loaded with mitochondria, so stuffed with mitochondria, that it literally looks brown under the microscope. In contrast, white fat has very little mitochondria. In between, as I talk about a lot, is beige fat, and you can actually turn white fat into beige fat by, believe it or not, uncoupling mitochondria. So brown fat burns huge amounts of calories that doesn't turn into ATP, and that's why they keep, for instance, a baby warm when the baby's really not eating very much. And so uncoupling mitochondria is built into our system. Getting back to your original question, why in the world, when we're starving to death, would we even throw more of these calories away? The answer is that not only do we want to protect the mitochondria from damage, and the less work they have to do, the less damage they do, but at the same time, this system of starvation tells mitochondria to make more of themselves, and it's called mitogenesis. Why? Well, I like to use the example of a dog sled, and I should have used it in the book. I thought about it later. If you've got one dog pulling your dog sled, the dog's not going to eat very much, but he's going to do a lot of work to pull that sled. If we hook 6 dogs to the sled, each dog literally has to do a sixth of the work of a single dog, but they're going to eat a whole lot more than that single dog. So what we do is each dog, each mitochondria, has far less individual work to do, which protects them from damage, but each mitochondria is going to use more energy. So the net effect is we can produce the same amount of ATP with a lot more mitochondria, and each mitochondria is wasting fuel. And therein lies the amazing factor of why your metabolic rate goes up if you're in ketosis. Because, surprise, surprise, ketones actually are signaling molecules that tell mitochondria to do this. So as Dr. Brand said, uncoupling to survive, looked in that content, makes a huge amount of sense. And everybody says, now wait a minute, that's just nuts. Why would we do that? And he says, well, I'll tell you what. Let's look at super old people who are thriving at 105 years old, and let's look at how uncoupled their mitochondria are. And lo and behold, super old people who are thriving have the most uncoupled mitochondria of any individuals. And you go, wow, Brand was right. That's just one thing that can make you really thrive, is uncoupling your mitochondria.
And so what you share in the book, and we're going to get into throughout the conversation, is how to enhance that uncoupling. And
Correct.
you talked about a couple of the benefits of uncoupling, one being the mitogenesis, so we're making more mitochondria, 2 being the wasted energy, which will lead to weight loss. And the third one you talk about in the book is the fact that this allows the mitochondria to repair as well.
Correct. So that's the third part. The mitochondria, again, making energy is damaging. And so mitochondria need to undergo repair. Now, one of the kind of revelations of the book is that there are actually only 2 mitochondrial antioxidants. Everybody thinks, oh, gee, you need antioxidants in your mitochondria to work on reactive oxygen species and free radicals, which is true. But it turns out you could swallow all the vitamin C in the world, all the vitamin E in the world, and it not only doesn't get to the mitochondria, but could actually have some bad implications. So there's only two. One is melatonin. And I spend a lot of time talking about how we've gotten melatonin all wrong. It is not a sleep hormone. It is a hormone that actually comes out during sleep for the purpose of repairing mitochondria. So association does not necessarily mean causation. The other is glutathione. And glutathione can be reconstituted by vitamin C. This is true. But glutathione and melatonin are the only two mitochondrial antioxidants. And I talk about that, a car has a service interval that we even have sensors on our modern cars that look at how hard the car is working, what conditions the car is running in, and it says, it flashes on your dashboard, check engine or time for oil change, etc. Well, we have a service interval, and our service interval is 24 hours, and that's our circadian rhythm. And the reason we have that service interval, and the reason we know that sleep deprivation is one of the most awful things that can happen to us, is mitochondria during sleep have to go under repair cycle. They have to clean up their act. And they don't have to produce much energy during sleep. So they use that time to repair themselves. And it turns out that that signal to repair themselves actually comes from melatonin and melatonin production, but it also comes from ketones. And ketones signal mitochondria, like we just said, to waste energy, don't hurt your cells very much, make more of your cells, mitogenesis, and actively repair your cells. So those three factors are actually kind of the miracle of what ketones do. As I talk about in the book, most people probably don't know, but if we have metabolic flexibility, that is the ability to change on a dime in our mitochondria from using glucose to using free fatty acids and or ketones as a fuel. And the minute glucose runs out, you should be using free fatty acids and ketones. And very much like a hybrid car. When you're running on gas, you're charging the battery, and let's just call the battery our fat store. When we run out of gas, we should immediately be able to draw on our battery and power the wheels that way. Really sad news is that normal weight people, only 50% of us are metabolically flexible, able to change. Overweight people, 88% of overweight people are metabolically inflexible. They can't make the shift. 99.5% of obese people, and that's now approaching 50% of Americans, cannot make the switch between burning glucose and fat as a fuel. So when we sleep, when we stop eating, it takes about 8 hours in a normal person, and most of us aren't normal anymore, to begin generating ketones. By 12 hours, normally, we should ramp up ketone production to a pretty good clip. So at 12 hours, 8 to 12 hours after we eat, we should start getting signaling from ketones to uncouple mitochondria to repair themselves and to build more mitochondria. The problem is almost nobody actually gets that signal anymore. And I go into why night workers, it's an unmitigated disaster because of this. So if you'll allow me to continue with that thought process, or we'll take a break, I think one of the most dramatic studies that I talk about in the book is the implication from calorie-restricted animal studies and then Italian athletes. There's a researcher at the NIH, Dr. Raphael De Cabo, who was very intrigued about why calorie restriction seems to be the only proven way to extend lifespan in almost every animal study. And this was proven in one set of rhesus monkeys at the University of Wisconsin, but the researchers at the NIH couldn't find the same results. And De Cabo said, and it was actually brilliant, he said, I don't think it's the lack of calories that was actually what was happening to these animals. When we study animals, we control when we give them food. And when you're calorie restricted, most of these studies, you put the food out at one particular time during the day. And if you're eating 30% less calories per day, you're really hungry. So when that food gets put out, you're going to eat it very quickly. And it's going to be gone. And so you're going to be fasting a lot longer until the food arrives the next day than someone who just gets to munch all day. So he designed some very elegant experiments using rats, and he basically wanted to show that it was the amount of time the animals were not eating that made the difference in their health, in their lifespan, in their metabolic flexibility, and even in their cancer and Alzheimer's rates. And so what he did was control the time of food that was put out and compared it to animals that got to eat all day long and all night long. Rats eat mostly at night. And he found that if he controlled when the full portion of food was put out to 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the rats would eat their food actually quite rapidly, and they would be fasting for a great period of 24 hours. On the other hand, if he just had food available for the rats 24 hours a day, they'd kind of munch all day long. He found that these animals who were time-restricted to their eating, time-restricted eating, time-controlled eating, intermittent fasting, lived about 11% longer than the rats who had all-day food. Now, that doesn't sound like much for a human being. That's 10 years of great life. And he showed that those animals who ate the same amount of food as the other rats were metabolically flexible. They could change between using fat and glucose, whereas the rats that ate all day long had no metabolic flexibility. And the rats who had time-controlled eating had no amyloid production, and they actually had far less cancer when they eventually did die. So that's pretty remarkable. Maybe it's not the fact that you're controlling calories, it's the fact that you're controlling time. So now, one of the most amazing studies uses Italian athletes, Italian cyclists, and they put them on a training table for 3 months. And most people know what a training table is. They had to eat the exact same food. What they changed was the time that these athletes got to eat their food. So one group had breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning, they had lunch at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and they had to finish dinner at 8 o'clock at night, a 12-hour eating window. The other group had break fast at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, lunch at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and dinner had to be finished at 8 o'clock, a 7-hour eating window. Same food, same athletic production. At the end of the study, the athletes who ate in a 7-hour window lost weight. The athletes who ate in a 12-hour window had no weight loss. But perhaps most dramatically is that the athletes in the 7-hour window plummeted their insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1. And people have heard me talk and write that if you had one marker to look at your possibility of longevity, it's IGF-1. Lower IGF-1, basically the longer you live and the longer you live well, the less cancer you have. The higher your IGF-1, more cancer, shorter lifespan. These guys plummeted their IGF-1. The 12-hour window didn't. So why in the world, with the same food, did the 7-hour window guys lose weight? All right, let's go back to ketones. So we start doing ketones at about 8 hours after stopping eating. 12 hours, we've really started to ramp up. So the 12-hour guys, they're just kind of getting the benefit of ketones, but then they eat. The other guys, they go another 5 hours of ketone production before they eat. And ketones uncouple their mitochondria for 5 hours longer than the other guys. So they waste fuel 5 hours more than the other guys. They repair their mitochondria for 5 hours more, and they build more mitochondria for 5 hours more. And so they lose weight. They literally do a caloric bypass using the same amount of calories. And that explains why these studies of ketogenic diets, that the basal metabolic rate goes up on a ketogenic diet if you do it right, because you're literally wasting more fuel. You're burning more calories, but not producing ATP.
I love how you tied that all together. So the highlights we want to gain from that are the fact that we want to restrict our eating window, produce more ketones throughout the day, and then that's going to be the uncoupling signal, which is going to allow all those benefits we talked about before, including weight loss, wasting energy.
Yeah, I mean, it's as strange as it may seem. I and others, talked about improving mitochondrial efficiency, and that's why you lost weight. In fact, if we were an efficient fat burner, then fat has 9 calories per gram versus carbohydrates and protein, which have 4 calories per gram. So if we were efficiently burning fat, we actually ought to gain weight because we're efficient. We're a Toyota Prius, that's an efficient vehicle. If I wanted to be efficient gas burner, I'd get a Prius. On the other hand, if I wanted to waste gasoline, I'd get a Ferrari because, man, that really wastes gasoline. Now, there's other reasons I might want a Ferrari, but if I wanted to waste gasoline, if I wanted to become an inefficient fat burner, gas burner, I'd turn into a Ferrari. And quite frankly, the evidence is we want our mitochondria to become Ferraris. And I kind of like my mitochondria as Ferraris because I'll never have one.
So we know now the goal here is to uncouple, and you get all these different health benefits. So let's look at it from a different angle. We know now fasting, it's going to produce ketones, it's going to help us uncouple our mitochondria. We can come at it now from a dietary perspective, and you talked about MCT oil earlier, and this can be a real hack for people that are metabolically flexible, that are producing ketones, during a fasted state. They can ramp it up and add MCT oil in and get more of an effect. But this also can be a great benefit for people who want to include some carbs, or they're early on in the phase here and they're not yet metabolically flexible. So let's come at it from this other angle and talk about how MCT oil can be used as a helpful tool to produce those ketones.
Yeah. So, getting back to these human studies of a low-carb ketogenic diet versus a regular high-carb diet, I mentioned that most of these studies show that there's no increase in metabolic rate on the ketogenic diet in most people for 3 to 4 weeks after they start it. And you go, well, wait a minute, they're on a ketogenic diet. If ketones are doing all this great stuff, what's the deal? Well, that gets back to the point that almost everybody is metabolically inflexible. And they have actually very high insulin levels. They have insulin resistance. And I'm sure most of your viewers know insulin resistance by now. And if they don't, I talk a lot about it. Insulin is fascinating. Insulin, when we eat, insulin is a fat storage hormone for any extra calories that we don't immediately use as an ATP production. And insulin literally unlocks the door to muscle cells and says, hey, guy just ate some great stuff. Here's what you want. And if there's any extra, insulin unlocks the door to fat cells through an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase and stores the additional calories and fat. So when insulin's elevated and you're trying to store fat, the last thing you want to do is take fat out of storage. That'd be dumb. Every time you put it in, somebody pulls it out. So insulin, when it's elevated, blocks the release of fat from fat storage, and it blocks it by blocking an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase. Hormone-sensitive, what's it sensitive to? The hormone insulin. So when insulin is elevated, you may have lots of fat in your fat stores, but you can't get it out until insulin falls, and then hormone-sensitive lipase is released. And as I've talked about in this book and other books, it's kind of like water everywhere, not a drop to drink. So most of us have an elevated insulin level. And most of us, even when we start a ketogenic diet, it may take 3 or 4 weeks for our insulin levels to drop enough for our free fatty acids to come out of fat stores, then go to the liver, and then make ketones. So it's actually a really long process, which explains Volchik and Veitch's work, and Vogel's work, Finney's work, that it may take 3-4 weeks to get a benefit in athletic performance, or at least get back to baseline on a ketogenic diet, because most people can't generate ketones. So the point of all that is MCT oil, on the other hand, MCTs, medium chain triglycerides, are unique in that they're absorbed directly from our intestines, unlike any other fats, and they go directly to our liver, where they are converted automatically into ketones. So the beauty of MCT oil is you could have insulin resistance, like most human beings, and yet still generate ketones if you get MCT oil. And I joke, you could have a fresh fruit salad, please don't, but you could have a fresh fruit salad and wash it down with a tablespoon or 2 of MCT oil, and you would generate ketones even though you've just eaten, the monster carbohydrate meal of the world. You'd still generate ketones, and the ketones would uncouple mitochondria. So that's one of the great things of unlocking the Keto Code. There's ways around this until we get to the point of releasing free fatty acids to take over the job.
Question for you. I want to stop on that fruit salad analogy here. So say somebody did that. Again, we're not recommending it, but it's possible. When they uncouple the mitochondria, are they wasting energy just from that fruit salad meal, or does that actually go back and waste energy from the fat stores on the body?
No, they'll just waste energy from the fruit salad meal. Unfortunately, you've got to drop insulin to release fat from fat cells. The good thing about MCT oil is, remember, the brain, it can't use free fatty acids. So if you're starting a ketogenic diet and you're really limiting carbohydrates and protein, the brain has to have ketones, but it can't get to the ketones. And that's why, you get the low-carb flu, the Atkins blues. That's why your brain doesn't work, your performance, tanks, because you just can't release ketones. You can't generate ketones because you can't release free fatty acids from fat. And we see this all the time. In fact, one of the patients I talk about in the book, Miranda, had been on what she describes as a perfect ketogenic diet for 2 years before she saw me. And she kept gaining weight on her perfect ketogenic diet. And when we looked at her, number one, she was not in ketosis after fasting all night. Number two, her insulin level was very high. And number three, she was a pre-diabetic after being on a ketogenic diet for 2 years. And, she was apoplectic that this could be possible. But when she started to realize that she hadn't designed her diet properly, as I go into in the book, it's no wonder that she was the way she was. And once we shifted to things like MCT oil and goat and sheep products, which maybe we'll talk about next, we finally started her generating ketones and uncoupled her mitochondria, and now she's a happy woman, lost a lot of weight.
Let's stick on the MCT oil here for a bit, like talking about it as an exogenous supplement. If somebody wants to include that in their healthy routine, is it better to take, you mentioned a tablespoon or two after a meal, is it better to have that all at once, spread that out through the day? And I also want to highlight the point too that if somebody does want to include that during that window of fasting, that won't break the fast.
Correct. Yeah, I like to spread it out through the day for several reasons. I see patients 6 days a week, and I see patients 6 days a week for the last 22 years doing this program that I do. So, and I get to see their blood work every 3 months. And so I get to see what works and what doesn't work. I don't have, anecdotes that, oh, I heard this was really good for you. So one of the things that's important is if you are metabolically inflexible, and again, most people are, you want to have this ketone signal happen multiple times during the day, and particularly at night. Women in particular often don't do well with liquid MCT oil. Many women get upset stomach, nauseated, loose bowel movements, even diarrhea. As I talk about in the book, many times if I switch women, particularly over to powdered MCT oil, and there's multiple powdered MCT oils out there now, they do a lot better. The other fascinating thing is that women, and men for that matter, do extremely well with goat and sheep milk products, which, surprise, surprise, goat and sheep milk, 30% of the calories in goat and sheep milk are MCTs, medium chain triglycerides. And fun fact, almost all MCT oils like C6, C8, C10 are named after the Latin word for goat, capra. There's capric acid, caprylic acid, and so on. That's because they were found in goat milk. So the really cool thing is you could have goat yogurt, sheep yogurt, goat cheese, sheep cheese, and actually get the benefits of MCT oil in something you probably want to eat. And we'll go into some societies where this has been proven. So goat cheese, goat milk is truly the goat, greatest of all time, of the cheeses because of the fact that it has huge amounts of MCT. Fun fact.
No, that's great. And I talked about the fact that if you're going to add MCT to, say, your black coffee or tea, which won't knock you out of your fast, let's compare that to having goat cheese. So if somebody, is in that morning dip and they're feeling like they're a little bit hungry and they want to include that, because cheese is, contains other things as well, are you still fasting at that point, in your opinion?
No, you're not fasting, but you're actually getting the benefit of the ketone generation from the MCT oil. One of my good friends is Walter Longo from USC Longevity Center, and Walter this past year published, I thought, a very important paper that I talk about in the book, is you can take people on a ketogenic diet who are fasting at breakfast and break them into two groups. One group was given one of his bars, and I'll call it out, the fast bar, which is basically a nut bar. The other group continued their fast till noon. And what he found was that the people who ate a nut bar continued to be in ketosis, even though they, quote, broke their fast, and exactly the same amount of ketones that the people fasting till noon was. So I thought that was actually very exciting news. And in all my programs, I say, look, if you can't make it till when I want you to start eating in the morning, have a handful of nuts or have a fast bar or one of my bars from Gundry MD, which are basically nut bars, or have some goat or sheep yogurt, or have a piece of goat or sheep cheese. And you will generate ketones. It's been shown in humans that 1 tablespoon of MCT will generate a nice bolus of ketones for a couple hours after you eat it. That'll keep your brain happy as you go along.
Well, before we part ways, I definitely want to get into a number of these other ways that we can help the mitochondria uncouple. And one of the big ones you talk about in the book is polyphenols. So let's talk about first what polyphenols are and how we go about getting those into the diet to have this uncoupling effect.
Yeah, I've been interested in polyphenols for actually 25 years now, and I used to present at the World Congress of Polyphenols every year until COVID. But polyphenols, and of course, so many of my products at Gundry MD are polyphenol based. Polyphenols are compounds that plants generate to protect their mitochondria, which are called chloroplasts, from sun damage, from environmental damage, from stress. And believe it or not, just like for us, we're dependent on oxygen to generate ATP. And at the same time, oxygen is incredibly damaging to mitochondria because of reactive oxygen species and free radicals. Same way with plants. They depend on photons from sunlight, but sunlight and photons are extremely damaging to their mitochondria, their chloroplasts. So they produce polyphenols, which are these bright colored compounds. The yellows, the oranges, the reds, the purples, the blues. Fun fact, in the fall in Ottawa, you see polyphenols in the trees. Those were there all along, except the green from all the chlorophyll kind of hid them. And when the leaf dies, now all you see is those gorgeous polyphenols. So how do polyphenols work? Well, it turns out that polyphenols uncouple the mitochondria of plants. So it prevents them from damaging themselves. Fast forward, when we eat polyphenols, number one, polyphenols are not well absorbed, but they provide fabulous prebiotic fiber for our gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome, in turn, converts those polyphenols into absorbable compounds. And the polyphenols, in turn, uncouple our mitochondria. And I think I said it on one part. I keep singing The Circle of Life from Disney's The Lion King because, eating the rainbow of vegetables, in fact, should be rephrased eating polyphenols, because the rainbow are the polyphenols that you're getting the benefit from, and they came from plants. And that's another reason that the high-fat, boring ketogenic diet has been shown to have some pretty long-term bad effects, because you don't get any polyphenols that you should be getting by eating plants and this rainbow. I think the most dramatic example that really headed me down the rabbit hole again is a phenol-containing compound called 2,4-dinitrophenol. There's the word phenol. Back in World War I, it was noted that munition workers in France and Germany, who were making artillery shells and gunpowder, were incredibly skinny, even though they ate a lot of food, and they couldn't keep weight on. And interestingly enough, they ran a temperature. And nobody quite figured out why this happened until the 1920s, when a compound called 2,4-dinitrophenol, DNP, was discovered in making of gunpowder, and lo and behold, DNP increased the metabolic rate of these individuals. Are we sensing a theme here? Some researchers at Stanford in 1930 said, oh my gosh, these individuals were really skinny and their metabolic rate went up. This is the greatest weight loss compound of all time. So they began prescribing DNP to over 100,000 Americans, and worldwide a lot more. And it was miraculous. If you took a low-dose DNP, you would lose a pound a week, no matter what you did. At higher doses, you would lose 5 pounds per week. I mean, whoa! I mean, miraculous. Unfortunately, there was a downside. People ran high temperatures. They began to have thyroid dysfunction. They developed cataracts, and this was before cataract surgery. And as I like to joke, you know, it'd be great fitting into that skinny dress, but you can't see yourself in the mirror because you got cataracts. And then people started dying. So in 1938, the FDA, as one of its actually first official acts, banned DNP for sale. And that ended the DNP, except on the dark web, you can still find DNP. But what they found, and they didn't realize this until 1978, that DNP was the first oral mitochondrial uncoupler. And it worked by aggressively uncoupling mitochondria. Why did people die? When you took a huge amount, you uncoupled mitochondria so much that the cells literally could not make enough ATP to survive, and people died. So, like I talk about with, these compounds, you want to find the Goldilocks rule. You want the little dab will do you. So the whole idea that phenols uncouple mitochondria came out of DNP in the 1930s.
Just to make sure I understand this correctly, when it comes to polyphenols, you mentioned there that they're not absorbed readily. Do any of them make it through into the bloodstream and to different cells throughout the body and eventually to the mitochondria to uncouple? Or is it all through the gut bacteria?
About 10% of polyphenols are absorbed. And one of the things that I mentioned in the book, which really blew my mind years ago at this polyphenol meeting, the head of this group is Marvin Endes from Paris. And he addressed all of us in Lisbon one year. And there are 1,000 researchers in the room. And he said, anybody who actually thinks that polyphenols are antioxidants can leave the room right now, because I don't have time to catch you up on what polyphenols really do. And that just blew me away because, in polyphenols, we talk about ORAC numbers, oxygen radical absorbing capacity. And that's the ability of polyphenols to absorb oxygen radicals. And he says, no, that's not what they do, you morons. They're not antioxidants. They're uncouplers. And get over it. We've gotten this all wrong. So, yeah, you can get a little bit of absorption of polyphenols, but most of the action actually comes from they're being converted by gut bacteria into their active compounds.
And when you say active compounds, is that the short
They're
chain
still
fatty
polyphenols.
acids, or they're
No,
still polyphenols?
They're still
Got it.
polyphenols, correct.
Well, let's stick on the gut bacteria for a while then. I just, segued us into the short chain fatty acids. This is another, reason that we need to maintain the gut microbiome. There's still polyphenols. When polyphenols get ingested through the diet, they help us get those, into the body, uncoupling the mitochondria. But then separately, when we take good care of our microbiome, it's going to make these short chain fatty acids, and then those are uncouplers as well. So everything's just tying itself together here. So talk about how that process works.
So when you feed gut bacteria, gut buddies that I call them, what they want to eat, which are soluble fibers. And soluble fibers are actually pretty easy to obtain in the diet. Interestingly enough, most polyphenol-containing foods also have soluble fibers in them. But the class of vegetables, which are called the chicory family of vegetables, like radicchio, some people call it the Italian red lettuce. It's not lettuce at all. Chicory, frisee, Belgian endive. I use Belgian endive as a dipping chip for my guacamole, which is great for you. And oh, by the way, guacamole has a lot of soluble fiber. So the chicory family is great. Asparagus is loaded with soluble fiber. Most tubers, like jicama, is loaded with soluble fiber. Inulin is probably the best soluble fiber there is. You can buy inulin as a powder. It has a slight sweet taste. You can sweeten things with inulin. So it's easy to get soluble fiber in our diet. The bacteria eat the soluble fiber. They ferment it. They then turn these into what are now called postbiotics. And I spent the last book, The Energy Paradox, extolling the virtues of postbiotics. Postbiotics are literally a communication system between our gut bacteria and our mitochondria. And some of the most exciting postbiotics are these short-chain fatty acids. Many people have heard of butyric acid or butyrate. Fun fact, butter is named after butyric acid because there's a little bit of butyric acid in butter. Not much. Sorry, Dave Asprey, my buddy. There's not much in butter. But that's where the word came from. Butyric acid is actually a mitochondrial uncoupler in itself. Plus, butyric acid is actually the substrate for the ketone beta-hydroxybutyrate, BHB, which is one of the main ketone bodies. And it just happens to be the substrate. But butyrate can uncouple mitochondria just as effectively as ketone bodies. Another fun thing that bacterial fermentation makes is another short-chain fatty acid called acetate. And there's another one called propionate. Acetate, most people know as acetic acid, vinegar. And acetic acid also uncouples mitochondria. So, apple cider vinegar. The miracle weight loss of apple cider vinegar is that the acetic acid in apple cider vinegar uncouples mitochondria. Balsamic vinegar. Put a little balsamic vinegar or apple cider vinegar in some San Pellegrino sparkling water, and you've got, your own uncoupling water for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And you uncouple every time you have it. Put vinegar in your salad. You uncouple your mitochondria. When you start looking at what all of these health things do, it all comes down to just one thing. They all uncouple mitochondria. Cool.
So you talked about the short chain fatty acids there. What about the gases those bacteria make? Is that part of the uncoupling as well?
Yeah, it turns out that we now recognize that there are gasomessengers that are the gases that these bacteria make during fermentation. And they are as simple as hydrogen gas. Believe it or not, methane is an uncoupler. Believe it or not, carbon dioxide is actually an uncoupler that I get into, and why carbon dioxide uncouples neurons very effectively. And hydrogen sulfide, which is thought to be toxic, is actually a major uncoupler that these bacteria produce. And this, nitric oxide is another mitochondrial uncoupler. And the discovery of these postbiotic gases won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2012. So it's not a fanciful idea. And as I talked about in the previous book, if you look, Japanese research found that people with Parkinson's disease have a gut microbiome that doesn't produce hydrogen gas, whereas people who don't have Parkinson's disease have a gut microbiome that produces hydrogen gas. So they actually gave hydrogen dissolved in water, to these people with Parkinson's, and their Parkinson's symptoms got better, showing that it was the hydrogen that was actually doing something to the neurons in their brain, which was uncoupling them. So it all starts to, the whole thing kind of starts coming together.
Earlier, we went deep on MCT oil and how you can use that as a tool to make ketones. And again, that would be an uncoupler. But what about taking ketones, exogenous ketones, as a supplement and going right to the ketone step and bypassing MCT oil? Does that work as well?
Yeah, it does work. The problem is it is incredibly short time limited. You get a bang and it's gone. I've used these things. I've tried every one on the market. Quite frankly, the ketone esters taste awful. I don't know if you've ever tried them, but and they're really expensive. The ketone salts are very palatable, but the problem with them is you just get this little bang and then they're gone. So you actually have to have them throughout the day, nearly constantly. And they're expensive, and you actually get a significant salt load if you keep doing it. So yeah, you can do it, and I mention it in the book, but it's so much easier just to use MCT or goat yogurt or sheep yogurt or goat and sheep cheeses.
Let's get into a couple of the other lifestyle factors. We went into fasting and how that can lead to the uncoupling through ketones. Let's talk about cold and hot therapy. These have become quite popular through saunas and cold water exposure and cold water showers. This is another way through lifestyle you can have an impact on the mitochondria. I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was a professor and chairman of cardiothoracic surgery at Loma Linda University for much of my early career, we developed techniques to protect the heart during bypass surgery or even during heart transplantation. And we learned that if we cut off the blood supply to the heart momentarily for about 5 minutes, you would then, and reperfuse the heart, you actually produce what were called heat shock proteins. And we knew that heat shock proteins protected the heart cells from damage during a long period when they didn't have any oxygen. Little did we know that heat shock proteins actually work by uncoupling mitochondria. So it protects them from damage. Fast forward to saunas. Saunas generate heat shock proteins. And lo and behold, saunas uncouple mitochondria. So it all comes around. The same way with cold exposure. Cold exposure uncouples mitochondria. Any stressful condition produces mitochondrial uncoupling. We've learned this from plants because the mitochondria sense, something bad is really about to happen, and I got to protect myself at all costs. And the way I protect myself at all costs is open these pop-off valves so that I don't damage myself in making energy. And this is what we've learned from plants under stressful conditions. And so we can duplicate that with cold or hot exposure. We used to call it hormesis. That which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. And we just, accepted that that's how it works. In fact, we used to teach that polyphenols work because of their hormetic effect. We didn't know what that meant. We just know it happened. Well, now we know that all of these hormetic effects work by uncoupling mitochondria.
Another modality I'd love to talk about is red light therapy. This has become quite popular in the health and wellness space over the last, say, 10 years. This is another way we can level up and add that into the routine to help with uncoupling.
Yeah, I was a consultant to a lighting company a number of years ago. And I was very interested in red light therapy, and I, worked with some really smart scientists going, wow, this is working at the mitochondrial level. We knew that much. And we thought it actually energized mitochondria, the mitochondria worked better when we exposed them to red light. And we were very excited because the red light and near infrared light could penetrate the brain and get to neurons. We actually showed that it penetrated the gut and actually changed gut physiology and actually changed the microbiome. And lo and behold, we now realize that thanks to understanding of mitochondrial uncoupling, that red light therapy and near infrared light therapy benefits mitochondria and their function by teaching the mitochondria, telling the mitochondria to uncouple. So all of these various modalities that we know work all come back to, just one thing, that they uncouple mitochondria. And just like Dr. Brand said, uncouple to survive. So if you want to survive and survive well, uncouple your mitochondria. And there's so many great ways to do it. And that's what I talk about in Unlocking the Keto Code. There's so many hacks you can do.
Well, we've given a lot of them here today, and
Yeah,
I'm
we
sure
have.
a lot of people are listening and thinking to themselves, okay, this is totally new information. This sounds great. I'm ready to jump in, but where do I begin? You guys have just, shared so much. Is there a certain handful of these players that we've talked about today that you'd recommend to the newbie, somebody who wants to start uncoupling, to get, off the ground?
Yeah. So for many, many, many years, we've known that there are certain thermogenic compounds, heat-generating compounds. I think you're having one and I'm having one, and it happens to be tea. It turns out that the reason tea and coffee is thermogenic is because it has polyphenols that uncouple mitochondria. Here's to my mitochondria. So just the simple act of drinking tea uncouples mitochondria. It turns out that turmeric uncouples mitochondria. Turns out that not only does coffee uncouple mitochondria, but caffeine in itself uncouples mitochondria. That's why people wonder why you have a cup of coffee, even an iced coffee, and you kind of get a little glistening and you go, what the heck, I'm having an iced coffee. Well, it turns out you're generating heat from uncoupling your mitochondria from caffeine. Now, I mentioned in the book, and no, don't do this at home, nicotine actually uncouples mitochondria. It's incredibly powerful mitochondrial uncoupling. But folks, don't smoke, please, and don't vape. You could do nicotine drops like Dave Asprey does, but let's not forget that nicotine is a potent addictive substance. And there's lots better ways to uncouple your mitochondria. So those are great tricks. But what I do, one of the easiest tricks to do is to gradually restrict your eating window down to about 6 to 8 hours a day. Now, I don't want anybody who's metabolically inflexible to say, oh, good, Dr. Gundry says first meal of the day is going to be at noon, and then I stop at 7 o'clock at night. Almost everybody falls flat on their face because they can't generate free fatty acids out of their fat. So here's what I like to do. I'll hold your hand. Let's suppose you normally eat breakfast at 7 o'clock. Next week on Monday, let's wait until 8 o'clock to eat breakfast. Let's just wait 1 hour a day. Do that for 5 days. Take the weekend off. Actually, there's good human studies showing that taking the weekend off won't interfere with what we want to do. We get through the first week. Next week, instead of eating at 8, we're going to go to 9 o'clock. Come on, it's just 1 more hour. We're going to do that for 5 days. Take the weekend off. So on and so forth. By the end of 5 weeks doing this 1 hour a day, working it away, we'll be at noon for our first meal a day. And it'll look like, hey, that was easy. This is an exercise program for your mitochondria. And you wouldn't go run a marathon right out the door. You wouldn't do weightlifting starting with a 40-pound dumbbell. Your arm would probably crash to the ground. You'd start with a 5 or 10-pound weight and work your way up. The same way with this. So many people fall off the wagon early because they don't realize that they just cannot release free fatty acids to get their brain what they need and get ketones generated. So I've been doing this for 22 years in my clinics, and it works.
And the good news about all this too is that you're bringing all these different health and wellness modalities into the book and into our conversation. And these aren't new things that people need to go out and learn, because if they've been listening to the show or listening to the work you're putting out, this is the stuff that we know has the health benefits. But now you're taking that and going deeper and explaining what's happening behind the scenes and why it's working.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, and you can, I talk about the medieval spice trade. The spice trade was, incredibly dangerous. 50% of people during the Middle Ages in the spice trade lost their lives trying to bring spices back to Europe from the Far East. And why would anybody risk that sort of lives? And why were spices so unbelievably expensive? Well, the only thing that reaches that is the drug trade. And people will risk their lives and spend huge amounts of money for drugs. And if you actually look at the spices that were popular during those days and look at what they do, it turns out the effect is always to uncouple mitochondria. Black pepper uncouples mitochondria. Cinnamon uncouples mitochondria. Ginger uncouples mitochondria. You name the spice that was popular and do a deep dive and check with Dr. Google, you'll find that they work by uncoupling mitochondria. So these people weren't dumb. They were paying lots of money to uncouple their mitochondria. In fact, frankincense and myrrh, two of the gifts from the Magi in the Bible, are actually mitochondrial uncouplers. Frankincense is boswellia, and a great mitochondrial uncoupler. Fun fact.
That's great. The new book is the Keto Code. And as I mentioned, as we opened up, I love the new book. There is so much in here. We got to get into a lot of it today, which was great. And I think just understanding the mechanism behind a lot of what we do to maintain our health and well-being is going to be motivating and inspiring for people to keep them on track. So thank you for all the great work you do. Thank you for coming back on the show. Other than people getting a copy of the new book, how can they connect with you after the show?
So they can come to drgundry.com. They can visit gundrymd.com, which is my supplement and food company. And if they come to gundrymd.com and put in the code Gundry30, I'll give you 30% off everything on the website just for your listeners. Gundry30 at checkout, and you'll get 30% off anything in the store as a one-time deal. You can find the book, Unlocking the Keto Code, wherever you get your books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Please visit your local bookseller. They'll have it, I promise. I've got multiple New York Times bestsellers, so they'll stock it, I assure you. And if they don't, demand it.
Well, I thank you so much for that discount for the listeners. And again, thank you for coming on the show. Take care.
Jesse, great to see you, and thanks for having me.
Thank you again.